Hello, everyone. Okay, so this is our first lecture on Thomas Aquinas. So this is just a super famous medieval philosopher, medieval theologian, responsible for um, just massive influence, both in Christendom as well as philosophy, right? So just a big figure. So the most famous thing that Aquinas has done or did is the synthesis of Christian theology and Aristotle. So Aquinas, kind of like Augustine, is famous for bringing together ideas from Christianity as well as ideas from pagan Greek philosophy. Okay, so unlike Augustine, he focuses primarily on Aristotle and some a little bit on Plato, but primarily on Aristotle. So Augustine did not have access to Aristotelian text, right? To any of the texts that we have today from Aristotle. That was all being uncovered as Aquinas was a student and during the course of his life. So Aquinas's big works are the Summa Theologica and the Summa Contra Gentiles. These are the highest theology and the highest responses to Gentiles. So these are his big works where he lays out just this entire canon of views where he responds to questions, right? And he looks at problematic responses to questions, ideas that would have been going around in his day, explains why those are wrong, and then explains his own view. So, super exciting stuff. Okay, so let's look at two examples of the synthesis. We're not going to go into a whole lot of depth about these examples, but these are two examples of where Greek philosophy influences Christian theology for Aquinas. So first of all is the view of the soul. So the Bible or scripture is oftentimes vague about like what a soul is, right? And so it's not really the Bible's not really in the business of just like offering this like super detailed account of what a soul is, right? Basically, the idea is something like we got one and maybe some features about it, right? So um, so we might have questions, right? And Aquinas thinks that it's important that we go about thinking about those questions. And he thinks that Aristotle can provide very interesting answers and ways to flesh out this view that's like talked about in scripture, but like not elaborated on. So the idea here is that the human soul is hylomorphic. So the view is hylomorphic dualism. The idea is kind of like you look, the body and the functions of the body constitute like the soul, right? We didn't talk about deanima in our Aristotle section, but Aristotle thinks that plants have plant souls, animals have animal souls, and humans have like human souls. And so the soul is wrapped up with the function of a given thing, right? So a plant has a vegetative soul or plant soul insofar as it can grow, reproduce, do all of these different things, like open up as like a bud, right? You know, a flower. It can do all of these things, and those things constitute its function, and that collection of functions constitutes its soul. Um, Similarly, a human has various functions. And so Aquinas wants to say that, in a very general way, Aquinas wants to borrow this conception of soul from Aristotle to explain what soul is in a Christian context, right? Um, Secondly, uh, Aquinas makes use of Aristotle's view of God as the unmoved mover, right? So the idea with an unmoved mover is that all things that exist sort of reach up to the unmoved mover, right? Things can, in virtue of becoming what they are, right, reaching all of their potentials, right? Actualizing all of their potentials, they are becoming closer to the unmoved mover, right? And so think about a piece of chocolate cake, right? The piece of chocolate cake doesn't come to you, but rather you are drawn to it, right? Or think about a member of the gender in which you are attracted to, right? Somebody who's attractive does not need to come to you, rather, you are drawn to them, right? So the idea with the unmoved mover is all things are sort of drawn to the unmoved mover, and the unmoved mover does not move towards them, things move towards it. So, um, God, or not God, not God, but Aquinas thinks that God functions like this in a Christian context as well, right? So, insofar as movement implies some kind of change or some kind of privation and potentiality, right? God has no privation or potentiality. So that means that God, strictly speaking, can't move, but rather we are drawn to God, right? God, in some way, given God's nature, God draws us to Himself, right? And so some of these divine attributes, Aquinas is borrowing from Aristotle, right? So um, rather than thinking that sort of God moves among us, right? In a strict in a certain sense, rather Aquinas thinks that we are moved to God, right? And he's going to Christianize this idea, right? With things like original sin and grace and whatnot. But the idea is here is that God does not change, and so God is unmoved in a relevant sense that He doesn't change. Anyway, so these are two examples of where Aquinas is going to be borrowing significant theological ideas from Aristotle. So, um, so we talked about the great synthesis. We talked about how Aquinas is working with pagan Greek philosophy to flesh out interesting theological views, and we saw two examples of how he did that.